Hi, everybody, and good afternoon. I want to thank you for joining us. My name is Daniel Horan, and I am Professor of Philosophy, Religious Studies, and Theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. I'm delighted to welcome you to this first installment of what has this semester been a new series sponsored by the Center of Spirituality titled the Ex Libris Author Lecture Series, which features authors discussing their recent publications on topics related to the mission of the center. Just a little bit about the Center for Spirituality. It was founded in 1984 with the generous support of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, some of whom I know are joining us via live stream right now, so shout out to our CSC sisters. The Center for Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, we draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice their faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our exciting event this afternoon, we wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land and to honor the Native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize these Native peoples and their cultures within our communities, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. So the format for our program this afternoon is threefold. First, Professors Stoltzfus and Shearer will provide an overview, a presentation of their work. And because this is our first time with co-authors, we're going to be remaining in the seated position up here rather than back and forth with the podium as has been the case. So I'm excited about that too, and to welcome two authors. We will then engage in a conversation on the themes of their book. So think of that as a NPR conversation, or dare I say, Oprah. I am not worthy to untie her sandals, but I guess I'm in the chair with a microphone. And finally, we're going to open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. So this includes both the folks who are joining us in real time in person here, our wonderful student worker at the Center for Spirituality, Ellie in the back, who is at the command of our live stream, will be fielding and receiving questions and comments from folks online. So feel free throughout our time together to post those, and Ellie will relay them to us. And she'll also be doing double duty, running around with the microphone so that the folks online can hear the wonderful folks here in person. So if you have a comment or question, write that down, get ready, raise your hand, we'll be ready to meet you. Just a reminder that the campus bookstore has copies of Ben in the Struggle available for sale in the lobby, and our speakers will be around afterward to meet you and gladly sign copies of the book, so stay tuned for that. Now, it is my privilege to introduce our guests today. Dr. Regina Shands Stoltzfus currently teaches at Goshen College and chairs the Religion, Justice, and Society Department. She is co-founder with her co-author, Tobin Miller Shearer, of the Roots of Justice Anti-Oppression Program, formerly known as the Damascus Road Anti-Racism Program. Regina teaches in the Peace, Justice, Conflict Studies, and Bible, Religion, and Philosophy departments at Goshen. Her courses have included Race, Class, and Ethnic Relations, Personal Violence and Healing, Spiritual Path of the Peacemaker, and Transforming Conflict and Violence. Regina has worked in peace education with Ohio Conference of the Mennonite Church, the Mennonite Central Committee US, the Mennonite Mission Network, and she holds a Master of Arts degree in Biblical Studies from Ashland Theological Seminary and a PhD in Theology and Ethics from Chicago Theological Seminary, just down the road from where I used to teach in Hyde Park, Chicago. Among other honors, she is the recipient of the State of Indiana's 2016 Spirit of Justice Award. It is the highest award conferred by Indiana's Civil Rights Commission, and she is also the 2021 recipient of the Everence Journey Award. Dr. Tobin Miller Shearer is the grandson of Naomi and Ozias, oh, shame on me, Ozias and Anna and Irvin, and the son of Valorius and John, life partner to Cheryl, and father to Dylan and Zach. He is the author of hundreds of articles, books, chapters, and essays on broad topics of race, religion, and the long Black freedom struggle. He is professor of history and director of African American studies at the University of Montana. So he's made quite a trip to join us. So from Montana and Goshen to South Bend. Along with Regina Shands Stoltzfus, he co-founded the Roots of Justice Anti-Oppression Program. And more recently, he has stepped into the role of executive director of the anti-racism training and consulting nonprofit titled Wider Stand Consulting. Tobin did his PhD at Northwestern University, where I was delighted to discover, and we discussed earlier today, one of his dissertation committee members was none other than Dr. Christina Traina, who just a few weeks ago we announced as our 2023 Madaleva Lecturer. So a great circle being gathered around here. Additionally, word on the street is that Tobin also bakes a mean peanut butter pie, but I have not seen this to verify it. So we have been told, but we shall see. Please join me in extending a very warm St. Mary's College welcome to Regina and Tobin. Thank you.
It's really good to be here to see you all, and hello to folks who are joining us online. We're going to start off by talking about how the book came to be and a little bit about the process. And I will start off by saying, as you heard in our introductions, we have been thinking about and working with anti-racism stuff for a long time. And so part of what we were thinking about was reflecting on that and things that we had learned and still wanted to learn. And I know that I was also in a place where because of the kinds of things that I teach and how difficult it is sometimes to even get through a semester where we are talking about violence and oppression and hard things, I was just really thinking about what is it that I need? What habits have I cultivated? What kinds of things do I want my students to have? And so in some ways, coming to thinking about and writing this book together represented something that questions that I was asking for my own teaching and for my own continued work.
Yeah, and I also want to say thank you to Dan and the center for inviting us, and for our audience members for joining us this evening. It's a delight to be here. I did bring Montana weather with me, apparently. I'd been hoping to come to Indiana and get a little break from our cold, but it followed me here, so that's okay. When we talk about how this book came about, we frequently reflected together on how the book itself is a dovetailing of our story, but then the writing of it was also a particular dovetailing. We use various languages to talk about issues of serendipity and calling and movement of the spirit. But I can remember at one point when we were in the midst of writing it, of us saying to each other that this felt like the thing we were supposed to be doing at this moment. And that sense of calling, of movement emerged again and again and again in the midst of its composition. And I think the fact that it came out in as short a time as it did is a testimony to that sense of mutual calling to the composition.
And that moment, those kinds of moments are very much in keeping with the kind of thing that has been part of our relationship for a long time now. If you've read the book, or when you read the book, you'll see a couple of stories where we get to a point and we just sort of look at each other and be like, yeah, that's the thing we're going to do. And that has been a real gift. The book is in many ways a testament to our collaboration over many years, but also to our friendship and trust in each other. So that's been very cool.
Yeah, we actually start the book with a comment that it may seem ironic or counterintuitive for a book that is critical of those approaches to dismantling racism that just focus on relationship, for us to start with talking about relationship. But we also note that spirituality is often counterintuitive, and there's nothing that's not counterintuitive about the both and statements
Right.
of the importance of relationship and the importance of orienting ourselves to systemic work in the midst of those relationships. And that was also part of the composition of the book.
Mhm. So let's talk about process
Let's do
for a
it.
little bit. So, oh, sure, thanks. Talking about process, first, let's talk about, so how did we even get started on thinking about writing a book together? There was an email.
Is this the email from Herald Press? that
This
we're
is the
talking about?
email from
Yeah.
Herald Press, yes.
Yeah, an email came to us. We had begun doing work again in a more intentional and frequent way than we had for a little while prior to that,
Mhm.
in the aftermath of the murder and torture of George Floyd, which had brought us sort of back into this work again. And then out of that context, I think even out of a panel we'd been on together that Herald Press, either sponsor or been connected to, the publisher, Amy Gingrich, then came to us and said, hey, do the two of you have a book in you? And it turned out that we did.
We did. And so we said, well, we said, yes, we'd be interested. And then they said, can you send us a proposal? Which we did. Which we did. And they accepted it and we got a contract. And that was in November of 2020
That's correct.
when we started the conversation. And our deadline was May of 2021, so that the book could come out in November of 2021. And I am proud to say that probably for the first time in my writing life, I beat a deadline. And it's in large part because of my partner here, who writes much faster than I do.
Well, the writing styles is part of the story, though,
Yes.
as well. Because what we decided to do is that we wanted to live the story as we wrote it. So we set aside at least an hour a week where we would meet by Zoom and just discuss what it is we've been writing about and how that conversation then emerged, formed the book. In that I would say something, whether it was about the topics of culture and racism, popular culture and racism, or what it means to even define an anti-racist spirituality. And then Regina would springboard from that and then would come back to me. And we often took copious notes. And even for our conclusion, we actually transcribed it. And that became our conclusion because the particular conversation there was just so rich and really exciting.
Yeah. So we divided up the chapters as, once we got an outline, divided up the chapters as to who would do the first draft of each of the chapters. And the rhythm of most of the weeks was that we would exchange drafts. Yours usually came on Thursday evening. Mine came on Sunday night, sometimes Monday morning, just in time for a Monday afternoon meeting. And we would talk about, we remembered a lot of stuff. We worked together for many years, so we remembered a lot of things. We helped each other remember things. We helped each other struggle through hard writing pieces. There was one chapter that I drafted that had the temporary title, "This Wretched Chapter." And just exchanged over the weeks back and forth and had lots of good conversation, good memories of the people in particular that we have worked with together over the years, and the memories of some hard things as well.
Yeah, that's actually what I was wanting to say next, is that Regina's been avoiding telling you how long we worked together, but anyone who reads the book is aware it's been 30 years plus at this point, 3 decades. But one of the things that, and I'll test this out with you, Regina, I think that's made our relationship work for that long, is that we're committed to being honest with each other.
Absolutely.
And that was a hallmark of the project we set in front of ourselves is that we weren't going to back away from any hard things we had to say about the mistakes that either of us had made.
Mhm.
And we were not going to shy away either from backing away from assessing some of the hard things we had to say about institutions we'd work with. We weren't going to attempt to try to make points or somehow get back at those institutions who'd given us very hard times, but neither do we want to pretend that it hadn't been a hard time.
Right.
And I think that was an important part of constantly reminding each other simply to tell the truth.
Yeah. And it was a good process, I think. I looked forward to those meetings. Yeah.
Yeah, I missed that. The other thing I was going to just sort of spin out a little bit, in the midst of exploring these themes, I became aware, as is often the case when writing a book, that I learned that I knew far more about the topic at the conclusion than I had at the beginning. Someone once reminded me that a writer is not so much someone who knows how to write, but a writer is someone who's found their way into a process through which something to say is made true and available. And I really appreciated the collective nature of that process writing alongside Regina, that I learned a lot from not just writing as a sole writer, but writing as part of a team, which we'd co-authored a book before, but it hadn't been as deliberately collaborative.
Right.
That way we sort of divide up a chapter, but this one, our voice is consistently presented in each chapter in very authentic ways, I think.
I think so too. And I think that that was one of the things that, I don't know that we were so worried about it, but the publisher wondered, even as they had asked us to co-author this book, about how we would arrive at a consistent voice throughout the chapters. And my experience was that didn't seem to be terribly difficult for us.
We had some conventions we used of italicizing sometimes when it would be just one of our voices, but there are points where you wrote stuff and I go back and read it and I was like, who wrote this again? Because
when I
genuinely
look
can't
at the
tell.
book, I'm like, there are some things that I'm like, yeah, I know you wrote that. Not in a bad way. But there are a lot of places where it's like, oh, who drafted that part first? Which is, I think that's a really good thing.
Do we want to talk a little bit about reception of the book at
Sure.
this point? One of the stories we have is there have been people who've read it and written about it and said you did a good job, such as Dan here. Thanks again, Dan.
Yes, thank you.
That. But we also had, and I think to a certain degree expected that there would be those who either didn't get it or simply didn't agree. And there was one instance pretty early on where we had someone write a review from what we now understand to be a very conservative outlet, who read it and accused us of saying that religion with a capital R was responsible for racism, which is something we don't come near to saying in the book at all.
We didn't say that.
We are disappointed with religious institutions that we've been a part of for not having been a part of the solution, and that there is a role religion has played in perpetuating racism, but that no way the point of the book. Long story short, we think that the reviewer actually didn't read the book.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked to our publisher about what we should do about this. And in this instance, where usually they say, just let it lie, we did write a response and posted it on my blog just to put something out there, which has been read probably more than his original review was read, which is sort of an interesting thing. But reception is always interesting to think about in the work we do.
Yeah, we've had lots of conversations with folks in this kind of context. More things we've done digitally, but it has been good to hear the questions that people bring. So we hope that you all have some questions for us, but to see where these stories that we tell go in the various places where people are receiving them. One of the things that we should probably mention is the definition that we're using, because that's a question. So what is an anti-racist spirituality?
What is that thing? Maybe it'd be helpful to actually read from the book about places where we attempt to do that. I have a favorite place where we attempt to do that. I should read that. Yeah. Should I just read it?
Just read it.
It's a short paragraph. Again, this is one of those places where I can't remember who actually did the first draft, but this is what we said. An anti-racist spirituality is a way of being in the world that draws on the unknown and unknowable, which some call spirit, others name the divine, goes by the word of mystery, relates to us as God. To encourage, empower, and enthuse amid the intention and the action to undermine the systems of white supremacy around us. It is marked by the knowledge of the warp and woof of race-based power, privilege, and oppression. It fosters truth-telling, first to self and then to others. It lifts up communal efforts, is not afraid of hard conversation, and invites laughter, joy, and human connection. An anti-racist spirituality encourages awareness of limitation while inviting all that has not yet been conceived, gestated, or birthed to move into the possible and be fully realized. It is strong. It does not demand perfection. It does not easily crumble. I don't know if that's sort of a very logical definition, but I think it is an effective in that it gets to the emotional content as much as the ideological and scholarly content that we were also working with.
Yeah, and I think that it prepares the reader, which is something that we wanted to do for what we are exploring in the book, which is not saying here are a list of spiritual practices that you can do in order to be an anti-racist. That is not what we're doing, but instead gleaning from what we have learned, what we have been looking for, what we have found, and what we hope will continue to sustain us and others who are on some part of this journey of doing anti-racism work, anti-oppression work, broadly speaking. How is it that we can find sustenance, community, and trust in the process and in the people who are working at the process with us?
And that's one thing I'll just highlight that is a particular gift that Regina brought to the conversation, is the reminder that you find throughout the book of the importance of doing this work with joy, in which we are finding ways to be in community with each other. We're finding ways to sustain each other, to get each other's back when things get hard. And I've so appreciated, Regina, the ways in which you constantly are reminding me that it's not all just about the work all the time, which would be my predilection.
One really quick story, and you can tell us when we need to shift, but early on in when we started Damascus Road, when we started this anti-racism training program, we were both working for a church institution, and the organization that we started without their permission actually was under that. And so when we would have meetings, we worked with a cohort of co-trainers, and we would meet once a year, maybe a couple of times a year that first time. And so it was bringing people together. And so that took resources. And maybe this is just a Mennonite thing, but I don't think it is. We like to make sure that we're getting, we are wise stewards of the money, which can be interpreted as when we are together, every moment must be spent working, or we are not being wise stewards of the money. And that was just not something that I felt was sustainable. And others joined with me. So from the very beginning, we made it so that there was joy in just hanging out, going out to eat, cooking together. Every single moment that we spent on these working weekends was not nose to grindstone, but forming relationships, cultivating relationships, and learning to know and trust one another, which is that theme that comes up again and again. Very, very important, because if it's not joyful, if it doesn't bring joy in some way, we're not going to keep at it. We're not going to do it.
And I remember some of those partners it was effectively our board at that point, saying to us, not when do I have to come to one of these meetings again, but when do I get to?
Yeah.
And I think, again, that was a real contribution you brought to the table there at the onset of our work together. I see Dan's turning on his microphone.
This might be a good time just to switch to continue the conversation, but maybe for me to jump in a little bit too. First of all, thank you both for being here, for the work you've done for decades, if I may say so, and for writing this book. Tobin mentioned in passing that I have written about it and I read it and loved it, and it's true. For those who haven't yet read the book, it's very accessible, but it's also very deep. It's hard to find a book that's so well written, that's so well resourced, and so applicable. And so that is a free ad. And a reminder for those in person, you can buy the book in the lobby. But one of the things too that you've already hinted at in talking about the process, and I'm so grateful that you began with this sharing of your experience, because a lot of our students, a lot of the folks in the community here, both in person and virtually, I think, who've never written a book or aspire to or might want to collaborate with others, are curious about how does that actually get done. So thank you for some of the behind the scenes look at that. I also want to say too, a shout out before I go further, that I heard about your book right as it was being published in the fall of 2021 from a St. Mary's colleague in the mission division, Rebecca Go, who directs our Office of for the Common Good. And so she knew of my own interest in anti-racism work and said, you should really check out this book. And so thank you. I think Rebecca's with us virtually, so a shout out to her.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah. Maybe a good place to begin. I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of questions and comments I'd love for you to engage before we open it up for comments and questions from the group here. The first is just a setting of our context. So we're at a Catholic women's liberal arts college. And so it's not presumed everybody here is Catholic or Christian or of any religious tradition. But since we come out of the Catholic tradition, there may be some folks who are less familiar, even in Northern Indiana, as we are, with the Mennonite church and the Mennonite tradition, which deeply anchors your anti-racist work going back to the 90s and beyond. And this book itself, though it's not exclusive, I should say that from the outset. It's very ecumenical and very applicable to those of any Christian tradition and no tradition at all, I would say, the so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Could you say a little bit about your, for those unfamiliar with the Mennonite church, a little bit about your own spiritual and faith tradition and how your understanding of Christianity and gospel life and discipleship informs your work in anti-racism and anti-oppression?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will start off by saying a question that I used to get a lot when I worked at some of the Mennonite institutions that are listed in my bio. People would ask me, so how did you meet the Mennonites? And I would say, well, I grew up in a Mennonite church. That's how I met them. But I grew up and was nurtured in my faith at an intentionally interracial Mennonite church that started off as a mission project of Mennonites in the 1950s. The unique thing about it was that it was intentionally interracial from its very beginning. And so my normal was growing up with Anabaptist theology, leaning heavily towards peace and justice work. A lot of that meant during mid-century, mid-20th century, a lot of that meant anti-war sentiments. But in my corner of Mennonite-dom in the US, it also had a concern with race and racism, because mid-20th century, you think about the liberation movements and freedom struggles that were happening at that time. Those were the things that we were talking about in our homes and at church. We were not race conscious as this is the good thing to do or be. We were race conscious because we were steeped in that version of the national conversation on race. And also race was a factor in, we got asked about it as kids, as Black kids going to a church with white people. We were asked, why do you go to church with white people? The white kids were asked, why do you go to church with Black people? And so on the one hand, it's like, well, why wouldn't we? Right? But it was something that we thought about. And so for me, growing up in that context with Anabaptist theology, but also when I was growing up and where I was growing up, it just made sense to me that my sense of what does God's justice look like included thinking about race and racism. And so I'll start there. Let you.
Yeah, like Regina, I've been part of the Mennonite Church since I was very young. And my family lines go back that way. And that's actually been a dynamic we've had to work with in being very sure when we're talking to Mennonite audiences that we are equally authentic in our Mennonite identity. Mm-hmm. Because too often names and family have defined that, and we are pushing back against that narrative. And so we've been very deliberate about that. I think the other twist in the story about our respective relationships to that Mennonite family, racism works itself out in twisted ways in many different settings. And one of the twisted ways it worked out in our story is that, I was talking with Dan about this over lunch, is that in the midst of the work we did in Anabaptist communities, particularly those that wanted to be seen as being on the right side of racism, that they were the ones that were liberal and had an informed perspective, it was easier for them to take out their frustrations about our work to disrupt and interfere with white supremacy by attacking me rather than Regina in public or otherwise. So part of my story is there's a period of about 15 or so years where I was shut out of Mennonite speaking opportunities, institutions wouldn't talk to me, et cetera, et cetera. And that was just came with the territory, that's the way it was. But it's been very interesting to observe the way, somewhat concurrent with the publication of this book, that those doors have been opened again in ways that had not been open to me for a number of years. So that relationship with the Mennonite community has been fraught in the midst of doing this work. And we tell some of that story in the book itself. And again, that's just part of doing the work. There's going to be those twists and points of disconnection and reconnection. And we recognize that as part of the rhythms of engaging in social change.
I really appreciate you bringing up that experience, because it's one of my bullet points of things to bring up if you didn't, which was, for those who haven't read the book yet, in the introduction, you tell a lot of the story, your origin story and the work you've done together and formation, spiritual formation, anti-racist activism and the like. And you mentioned this experience of forming Damascus Road and the response of the Mennonite Central Committee and the kind of, let's say, reaction that you received, the kind of response you received. And Tobin, you just shared right now a little bit of how that was experienced by you. I'm wondering if the two of you, for those who haven't yet heard the story, if you could recap a little bit about it. And this is not in any way to kind of point a light on the Mennonite Central Committee or the Mennonite Church, because I think there are resonances. The reason I ask is in other Christian traditions, like the Roman Catholic tradition, which is my tradition, and as a clergy person in that church, as a religious, very mindful of the fact that in predominantly white spaces, there is at certain moments and points in time and history, a desire to want to be, as you put it a moment ago, on the right side of this, right? But what are the consequences? What does that mean? Are you willing, as to quote the gospel, Jesus says, are you willing to drink from the cup from which I drink? And I think you tell a very interesting and very powerful and compelling and not always positive story about what the institutional leadership, the religious leadership presented when, you know, well, let me ask you, I'll let you take it from there.
You start.
So these stories are always challenging to tell because we neither are interested, as you said earlier, in sort of scoring points, but we also want to have a story from which others can learn. And our work within the context of Mennonite Central Committee was simultaneously one of the organization giving us considerable resources and a name that would be taken seriously within that community. And at the same time, pushing back hard anytime we would bring the attention of our work back home. It was one thing if we're out working with other Anabaptist groups and challenging them on their participation in patterns of white supremacy. It's a whole nother thing once we say, and by the way, we've got work to do here. And so that took form from everything from multiple attempts to fire me in my position to having trainings at the headquarters blow up because people came loaded with books and articles and anything they could use to what they had anticipated we would say before we ever said it. Mm-hmm. And that just kept replicating itself over time, not only during our tenure, but in our colleagues who had our positions after we'd left.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what you said. It is a pattern that probably people in this room have experienced. You can say it out there, but when you bring it home and hold the mirror up to our own institutions, there's resistance to that. And one of the lessons that we have learned from that is a very predictable pattern. And so if, and just to quote Frederick Douglass, if there is no struggle, right? And so we anticipate those moments of struggle and sort of, many of them are kind of predictable. And if they don't come in some way, it makes me wonder, well, are we doing it right? Did we miss a step? Because there is, I think that human inclination to think that, well, that it does happen out there, it doesn't happen in here because we're the good ones, right? But there's always more to learn, and and particularly when we're talking about anti-racism and anti-oppression, we really, really, really need to be looking at and thinking about the way that our systems work. It's not just about we get along and we don't call each other names and therefore we're not being oppressive, but what is it that is being done in our name that is closing out opportunities for people, that is making it impossible for groups to build a critical mass within an organization. And I think that was one of the dynamics that was working in our favor in some ways to cause that disruption, is that there was at that time a critical mass of people of color and white allies we were not by any means lone voices pushing against the institution by ourselves, but we had a cohort of people, and we had that critical mass of people of color. I think was very, very important for what was possible and the things that did happen, good and bad, with the organization that we were working with at the time.
Maybe continuing on the same theme, you have the chapter on spiritual formation, and to quote you, both of you, either of you primary authors, revisers, however it was in the working behind the scenes, there's a line that I think really encapsulates what we're talking about. You say, "It is one thing to do an analysis and have head knowledge of white supremacy, and quite another to face it in your own house," end quote. And I think of that own house as we're reflecting on it and you're sharing, and I think of it in several ways. The family homes, for instance, and family units of white folks in particular, but people like myself, the institutional and religious houses of work and worship, like academic institutions, like faith communities, the home of our local community, our state, our nation in which one lives. I think of the state of Indiana, for instance, and Tobin and I talked a bit earlier today about the state of Montana, in many ways parallel in some of the home-like challenges. So I guess my follow-up question is, what advice or guidance would you offer to folks, and I would suggest perhaps white folks in particular, who want to face white supremacy in their own house? What does that look like in practice?
So we're doing a lot of work consulting with predominantly white institutions right now on this very question. And there's a couple key things we find ourselves continually referring to. One of them is to be able to maintain the state of non-anxious presence, which is a term that comes to us from the conflict transformation community that Regina has brought to the table, in the midst of that work. Because the bigger task in any of those settings is to decouple work on addressing the dismantling of white supremacy and crisis. Because most often, predominantly white institutions come to the table to do this work only because they've been pushed there from external forces or dragged there from internal forces, usually around the threat of a suit, of some kind of legal action. The more we can do the work without having that coupling of crisis and the work, the more powerful it becomes and the more sustainable. So I think that's one thing, being the non-anxious presence. Another quick two I would note, one is the importance of being stubborn. As we trace over time of the work that we've done, we note that those institutions that have been most successful in actually bringing about change simply have stuck with it and stayed in the struggle. And the final thing is, it's not enough just to be enthusiastic or make public statements about the work. It's really critical that you bring the sophistication to the work, that you have an understanding that some things are going to need to happen before others. There's a sequencing to the work that needs to happen. There's an importance of having a grounding in an analysis of the way that we need to focus on power, privilege, and hierarchy, not just celebrating differences, for instance. There's a host of other things that we talk about when we're doing consulting around this, but those are some of the markers that we've seen be particularly successful in these settings.
And I would add, to understand and live with the reality that institutions are designed not to change. Institutions are designed to stay the same when people come and go. I talk about this with my students a lot, and we're in an institution of higher ed in this setting. The population is constantly changing. Of course, students are in and out in a certain number of years, but the faculty and staff are not there. And so any institution will put rules and regulations, policies, practices, and procedures in place so that they stay the same when the people come and go. And so recognizing that and thinking about, so if we want something to change, we have to be strategic about it, and we have to have a long-term strategy so that when I leave my job or a student graduates, the next ones that come along don't have to rebuild the same ground that the folks who were gung-ho and enthusiastic about it when they go on to something else, which is why that initial passion for a project is not enough to sustain it. You really need to have strategy in place, and it needs to be long-term strategy. And I think too that it's helpful to have folks on the inside that are working on the strategy and folks on the outside that can also push the institution along.
That's really insightful. I'm going to be reflecting on the importance of being stubborn, which maybe some of my colleagues and friends will not want me to reflect on. But especially, Regina, your point about institutions are not designed to change. And I think about that in the kind of conflict or tension that exists, particularly in faith communities and institutions of religion. And I'm struck by something you two write in your book. You say, the kind of love that grounds an anti-racist spirituality is not just about fondness, care, or tenderness. Mm-hmm. And I'm reminded, of course, of some other instances of this. Part of it is this agapic love we hear about in the Christian tradition, which is a hard love, a difficult love, a challenging love. I'm also reminded of the great social justice advocate and co-founder of the Catholic worker movement, Dorothy Day. Mm-hmm. One of her favorite quotes, it's well known, and comes from the novel The Brothers Karamazov, which reads, "Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams." And I'm curious, given your emphasis on grounding in the faith tradition, a grounding in spirituality, a grounding in joy, How do you understand the love that Christians are called to live? And what does this love have to do with the work of anti-racism?
The first thing that I think about with that question is, if we step back and ask the question, so what does justice look like? Does justice look like you are not physically harming me or calling me names in this moment? Absolutely, right? I'm all for that. All for people not calling me names, all for people not harming me. But justice also looks like everyone's needs are met. And so part of the work, part of that love is saying, whose needs are not being met when we're thinking about the way that racism and other forms of oppression work. We're thinking about harm being done, but also thinking about who has access to things, whose needs are being met, whose needs are being met at the expense of other people's needs not being met. What does justice look like in that setting? And so for me, that's the kind of love that I think that we are called to, a love that makes space for justice to happen. And so it is pushing up against those things that feel really good to someone because their needs are being met, and they may not recognize that their needs are being met at the expense of someone else's. And so part of the work is, yeah, this is how this has happened. The land acknowledgement that you did at the very beginning of our time together is representative of that. It is a reminder that this land was not empty, right? This land was not empty, and there were and are and will be people who have had many things taken away from them so that many others of us have access to what was taken away from them. So that broad question of, is it Cornel West? Love is what justice is. Yeah. I'm afraid to say the quote because I don't want to say it wrong, but it's something like, love is what justice looks like. Justice is what love looks like in public. Thank you. So that, yeah, around the garden to get to that quote. Yeah, thank you.
I love the question about love. I mentioned that we're doing a lot of work with predominantly white institutions who have come to us in our wider stand work that we're doing together and said, we want you to do an audit for us. And one of the things that have jumped out to me now that we've done a dozen or so in the last year and a half is we'll get to the debriefing point where we've had a team, they've done an in-depth dive of their documents, done focus groups, and brought back recommendations. And every time the shock in the room is palpable after having read our 30-page report, in which we're not just saying, you are doing great work. Let's tell you the great work that you're doing. And you're doing such a great job because you came to us to ask to do an audit. But actually we're coming back with, we think there are some really, every time, there's significant issues. Here are the significant issues that we want to bring to you. And our colleague, Tulani Moore, has helped us frame the conversations in a process of grieving. That part of the loving work we're doing with these clients is giving them some hard truth and walking with them as they grieve that they're not where they thought they were. And they've got more work to do than they had ever even conceived of. And it's a discipline for us as the ones bringing that information is not to do it to beat up on them, but out of a sense of love and concern and compassion that we don't want just to give you a message that will end up with you not doing anything differently, because that clearly is not working for you. And there's some things you need to do differently, and they're going to be challenging, but we think that's the way forward.
I appreciate that. It gives another kind of texture to the old time expression, tough love, right? In a non-abusive, non-aggressive way, but love can be hard, right? Hard to receive, hard to give. So I want to make sure we have time for comments and questions from our in-person and virtual audience, but I have one particular question for each of you respectively. I have lots more things, so if people are still thinking of things to say, I can always revert back to my bullet points. But let me begin with you, Tobin. As someone who strives as a fellow white man to do the work of anti-racism, who believes in the importance of spirituality, and who knows that white people and predominantly white institutions and communities rarely talk about systemic racism, let alone whiteness, as you alluded earlier, I really appreciated your statement that and I quote, white people need to start by spending some time talking about being white, end quote. Now, to some people, this might strike folks as counterintuitive in the work of dismantling anti-Black racism and white supremacy. And you propose something, it appears in your book jointly several times, of white caucusing, which was a new phrase to me. And so I just want to ask you, what does that mean? And what are the impacts of this kind of discussion about whiteness? Why is it so important?
Oh, so much to say there, because it is such a critical practice. And I think we can use the language of discipline. For those of us who are white, most of us have been conditioned to say nothing about our racial identity, or to say things in ways that bring nothing but awkwardness to the table. One of the things that white caucusing can do is to help us as white people walk alongside each other in an accountable framework. And that's such a key part about this, that we're being accountable for the work we do to our sisters and brothers of color. But it can be a way for us to practice, to stumble, to learn to have more sophistication and nuance, to be better partners in the work of dismantling racism in a setting where that's not proving costly for people of color, to have to listen to us try to get the words of racism out of our mouths, to try to say something about us as white people that is reflective, that helps us be better allies rather than those who aren't equipped to do the hard work. Those are spaces for us to explore that. And I've done some writing. The book talks about some principles that we can use to guide that. But it is a space to practice and learn in ways that isn't proving costly to our brothers and sisters of color.
Thank you. I think it's really important, and there's a lot more to unpack there. I have so many more things to say to both of you, but one last note before we open this up. For you, Regina, one of the things, just for our audience, in the book itself, you have so many very compelling, moving, challenging stories, as you mentioned in your introduction. And I was struck in a particular way by the story of your mother's book, the children's book, and the disparity between its illustration and the lived realities that provided the very foundation for the story. It is striking. Can you tell us, especially those who haven't read the book or don't know the story yet, what happened in this children's book? And what lessons might you see about systemic racism and white normativity that play out in this case that could be instructive?
Yeah, I love telling that story for one very large reason. My mother was the champion of making sure that her children knew Black literature, Black arts. She was a theater kid and she raised us to be theater kids. And so stories and books and plays and music were part of our existence. My mother also is a writer, and she wrote stories for us, and she wrote a book that she had published in the late 60s, early 70s about our actual bird named Snowflake. The book is called Snowflake. And I appear in it as Gina and my little brother Stevie, and she wrote the book, and it was published, and it was illustrated, and the illustrations in the book were of little white children. It was a white family that was depicted in the book. And at that time, it was really difficult. It's still not the easiest thing in the world to find lots of books about children of color that are not about race, just about like being a kid in the world. But at this time, it was almost impossible. And that was one of the reasons that she wanted to write a book. And she didn't have a say in what the illustrations were going to be. And I actually had to find the book. I have a copy of the book that I think I either bought it on eBay or somewhere because my other copies of it that I had when I was a kid, I don't have anymore. But yeah, it speaks to the pervasiveness, but at the same time, the supposed normalcy of what a family was at that time and continues to be. I would say, listen to some of the pushback on what children should be taught in school, K through 12, and you will hear echoes even now of people's ideas of what a family, particularly what an American family, is supposed to look like and be. And so that kind of pushback is not the same as it was in the early 70s, but it's still there, it still remains.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So that's a little taste of some of the really moving stories, powerful and challenging anecdotes that are throughout the book. And I'm reminded too that the sense of white normativity, you shared a bit about this question very early on when people ask like, well, how did you get hooked up with the Mennonite church, as if you weren't a lifelong Mennonite?
Right.
And I know that so many of my sisters and brothers and other siblings of color in the Catholic Church often get that, especially with this erasure, as it were, of a longstanding historically Black Catholic community. They assume that to be Catholic is to be white, or to be Mennonite is to be white.
Exactly.
And so thank you again for that witness and for that sharing. Why don't we open it up for comments and questions for folks who are with us in the room or who are joining us online. Ellie has a mic to pass around. If anyone has something to share or say or ask. Not everybody at once. Back, yes.
Hi, thank you so much. One of the things that's just already ruminating and I'm going to keep thinking about is your early comments about the importance of joy in this work. So it's inclining me to ask another, I don't know, maybe more optimistic question, which is, I'm thinking about how long you two have been doing this work. Are there things about this moment and the conversations that you're involved in that are giving you hope? I think of hope and joy together. So I'm curious if there are things that are giving you hope right now.
I can name a couple of things right off the bat. One is, I was just thinking as we were having this last bit of discussion and you talking about white caucuses and that sort of thing. It was when we started doing this work together back in the 90s. People didn't want to be called white. They wanted to be called Mennonite. They wanted to be called German. They didn't want to be white. And it was the same for me in the classroom with my students. And so the evolution of comfort with even talking about whiteness as a thing that exists in the world. And then the other one is also about words. We are real big on doing this work means that we have to have a common language, that we know what words mean when we say them. When I say this word, this is what we're talking about, and we're all on the same page. And so people didn't want to say racism either. It's just like, do we have to say racism? Like, it's so negative. Yes, it is. It is. That's why we're against it, right? And so I do see, and certainly we can look at the long arm of history and see that because of the witness and work of people who have come before us, there has been change. And now is our time to be part of that. And so the things that we are working on in this moment, we may not see the change that we envision, but we know that the work that others have done have made it possible for us to have this conversation, right? So for me, that's where a lot of hope is grounded. And I will end by saying I don't always feel hopeful, but I do have things that bring me back into a place of being hopeful.
Speaking of elders, one of the elders in the work before us is Vincent Harding, an African-American activist and historian. I'm spending a lot of time with his writing in this juncture. Just this morning, I read a passage where he talked about hope, and he framed it this way. He said that even in some of the most challenging moments of, he didn't use the word civil rights movement, but that chapter of the long Black freedom struggle that we talk about that way, say after the campaign in Albany, Georgia, that was ostensibly a failure. They didn't meet their goals within the time period they set. He said, even in that minute, every one of us who were involved in that exercise of trying to bring about change, bring the memories and experiences of the struggle itself forward into the future. And he says that's the most hopeful thing he knows, is that even in the midst of failure, we're bringing the struggle with us. And so I will reflect on that for a long time, because I think right now we're engaged in a training contract with a large public institution in the Northwest part of this country that's incredibly intense. Every time Regina and I are doing the training component of it, that we're on a Zoom call with 50 people doing a training session. The county lawyer is there, the elected commissioners are there, every member of their human resources is there, all of them waiting for us to make a mistake and to jump in and say literally what you're doing is illegal because of some standing statutes around critical race theory that are hanging over the head of what we're doing. So I think about these elders in front of us when we're engaging in one of those very contentious moments, that regardless of the outcome, we're going to carry this struggle forward. And that's very hopeful.
Thank you for that. It also reminds me theologically of a notion of dangerous memory, something that Johann Baptist Metz wrote about, and that carrying that memory forward, carrying that work forward. So thank you for that. I think, Ellie, we have something online. Is that right?
Yeah, we have a question from Adrian. How would you suggest raising anti-racist children?
Did that come through the?
I think we did. You raised some. I raised some. Talk about race. And talking about race does not have, it can be age appropriate. It can be matter of fact. It's so helpful for children to understand things that, or to help them try to make sense out of things that don't make sense. And so knowing our history, it's just one more quick story from my mother, the hero. Her writers group was very frustrated about the lack of books about African-American history in the schools. And they formed a little publishing house and wrote stories about history and had them published and gave them to the schools, saying these stories are important. And so, I mean, I'll let the historian talk more about that, but knowing our history, knowing those names, being able to call forth and talk about what has happened and what people have done because of what has happened. I regularly encounter my college students who are furious about what they did not learn about the history of this country, the racialized history of this country. Why now it's Emmett Till. The further we get away from the lynching and death of Emmett Till, the less people know his story. And so in one of my classes, when we talk about Emmett Till, I get several reflection papers from students that say, I had no idea. I did not know anything about this story at all. So knowing our stories and telling them, and it can be done in very age appropriate ways.
Yeah, echo everything Regina just said. A couple anecdotes to go alongside that. We have two sons, cisgendered, identify as male, both white. And it's been a delight to continue to have conversations with them that we started very early on. So one of the things we did, like Regina suggests, we had natural, normal, and frequent conversations about race at the dinner table. Came up. We also tried very deliberately to find ways to walk along with our sons in taking risks. So one anecdote that sort of gets at that, I think it was Dylan, our older of our two sons, came home with a alphabet I, H is for horse, I is for Indian. And we're like, okay, Zach or Dylan, let's have a conversation about this. What are we going to do about this? Because this is making an object about our Native American friends. How are we going to respond to that? And we talked about it and we came up with a strategy that, again, was it Zach or Dylan, were comfortable in having me go alongside with them, talk with their teacher. And that was no longer a thing. It became a teaching point for the whole class. So just another example of taking risks. The other part is to be open and vulnerable for when we as parents haven't done it as well as we should. The way I'll talk about that is our son, Zach, was doing stand-up comedy for a while, invited us to finally go see him. He wouldn't let us see us. This is when he's an adult. The whole bit he did, the routine that night, was making fun of having grown up with a white father who did anti-racism work. And he had bit after bit after bit of those times where I'd perhaps gone a little bit overboard, such as first reading the Harry Potter's books to them out loud and substituting black magic references to purple magic. So when they got to middle school, they're talking about purple magic in Harry Potter and no one knows what the heck they're talking about. And I won't say all the routines. It was all at my expense. Very funny, but being open to that kind of feedback was also pretty critical.
Yes, down here. Ellie's got the microphone for our friends online.
So I'm a Mennonite, so I don't know if this question will be interesting to everybody here, but I think sometimes the places where the Mennonite church has disappointed me are places where their identity as peacemakers has sort of been an obstacle to doing hard things for inclusion. And so I wonder, because it's somehow easier to not rock the boat or to keep all the sides happy or something like that. And so I wonder if you've run into this working in, I mean, I'm sure you've run into working in Mennonite spaces, but I wonder, like, so how do you get Mennonites to kind of loosen their grip on that peacemaker identity enough? Because I think the justice and peace obviously go hand in hand, and Mennonites care deeply about those things. But I just would wonder if you've run into that kind of obstacle and how you think about shaking it up a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, I've met that. Yeah, I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about being stubborn, about being persistent, and challenging places where, because I think another element that can be present in that kind of dynamic is conflict avoidance, right? So conflict avoidance, maybe some folks in peacemaking communities, Mennonite and otherwise, have so bought into an understanding of peacemaking that means we are never angry, we are never in conflict, and so we become conflict avoidance. And part of working with that is modeling and helping people move towards conflict instead of away from it. This might be the most tangent that I will make today, but when we started and you talked about the style of talking and invoked Oprah. I had a moment of, I know what that is like, because in doing this work, one of the things that was very true for me in workshop settings was I didn't want to tussle with people. And so if they were going to get mad at me for doing this work, I didn't really want to hear it. Not effective when you are about doing the work. And so one of the things that I trained myself to do, and you witnessed this growth in me, is to physically walk towards a person who was being antagonistic with me in a training. And I channeled Oprah. Like, I really did. I thought about back in the 80s when she was still doing her show, and she would walk around in the audience and she would walk up to people. I'd be like, and I would, in my head, I'd be like, it's not you, it's Oprah. So you can do it, right? You can do this hard thing. And now I don't have to do that self-talk as much anymore. But it was a way that I helped myself not be conflict avoidance, because if I'm going to do this work, then I got to be able to walk into it. And hopefully that modeling that for other people as well.
The identity of white, let's talk about it as whiteness, is consistent, but it's also particular. In the case of white Mennonites, one of the expressions of whiteness in that community is that when faced with conflicts around challenges to white supremacy, white privilege, white identity, our observation has been that white Mennonites flip in one of two directions. All of it's about conflict avoidance, but it either goes the pathway of quiescence or the pathway of petulance, where quiescence is drawing on this idea that we're the quiet in the land. And so we haven't really participated in racism to the same extent as all the other white people. And the other pathway of petulance, and this sort of comes particularly from the thought and work of our colleague Iris De Leon Hartshorn, who's given a lot of thought of attention to the continuities and legacies of martyrdom in the community, that we aren't like white people because we have a history of 5 generations, 10 generations back, our people were killed for their beliefs. So we also know what it means to be marginalized. And all of that are distancing maneuvers from dealing with the conflict necessary to actually address issues of the expression of white supremacy right in our own house. So having named those patterns, I think, is the first step for many of us who are white and Mennonite to be able to have a possibility of being more comfortable with the conflict that's going to be implicit in this work. And that's been a challenge for sure. Thank you for the question.
We're just about coming to the end of our time. I can't help resist thinking of Oprah as a patron saint of sorts, as she is for so many people. You know, in Latin, the invocation for an intercession of a saint is ora pro nobis, pray for us. But I feel like we can abbreviate that to Oprah pro nobis, Oprah for us, which might be a good mantra in settings like that. Though I'm sure there are a lot of other comments and questions, both in person and online. I want to respect the time of our guests and the time of those joining us, and draw this time together to an end. But before I do so and extend one more final note of gratitude to Tobin and Regina, to just share with the community gathered here, our faithful remnant in person and those joining us in multitudes online, that this is the last of our 3 Ex Libris author series presenters and presentations this semester, but we have 3 more lined up in the fall. So keep an eye out at stmarys.edu/spirituality. We'll be updating that in the coming weeks and months. And we'll have more events as well posted for our fall semester where you'll be able to join us in person. And hopefully the pandemic recedes enough so that we get more people in person, but always as well in live stream. So please, for those virtually and those in person, join me in thanking Regina and Tobin for your work, for your conversation, for your witness, and for this fantastic book that you've broken open in greater detail for us this afternoon. Thank you.